Well, you've probably seen cameras advertised with X number of stops of image stabilization built in, or you may have seen lenses advertised with X number of stops optical stabilization built into the lens. But what on earth does that actually mean? Well, there is a rule of thumb that says that your shutter speed should be a maximum of 1 over the focal length of the lens you're using. So say for instance you're using a 50mm lens, the maximum shutter speed you should go to is 1/50th of a second in order to not introduce camera shake into your image. And it corresponds. Say you're using a 200mm lens, therefore your shutter speed should be the maximum of 1/200th of a second in order to not introduce camera shake. Okay, so how does that relate to the X number of stops of in-body image stabilization or optical stabilization within a lens? And what is a stop? Well, the stop is double the length of time of the shutter speed. So say for instance, one stop from 1/50th of a second, double the length of that shutter speed would be 1/25th of a second. Double it again and that's 1/13th of a second of shutter speed. It's along those lines. So every time you add a stop, you're essentially doubling the length of the shutter speed. And the same applies to ISO, the inverse applies to the aperture. So when your camera advertises that it has 5 stops of in-body image stabilization, that means essentially you can double the length of your shutter speed 5 times before theoretically you'd start to introduce camera shake into your image, causing blur. Okay, so let's take an example here. Let's say you've got a 400mm lens. Of course, the rule of thumb suggests that you should shoot at a maximum of 1/400th of a second in order to avoid camera shake in your image. So with the 5 stops of image stabilization, you can double the length of that shutter 5 times. So doubling from 1/400th of a second is 1/200th of a second. Double it again, 1/100th of a second. Double it again, 1/50th of a second. Double it again, 1/25th of a second. Is that 5 times? 400, 200, 100, 50, 25. Okay, so theoretically with the 5 stops of in-body image stabilization, it allows you to shoot a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, and that is a really long shutter speed for a 400mm lens. You got the 50mm, that's 1/50th of a second, you double it, 1/25th of a second, you double it, 1/13th of a second, you double it. 1/8th of a second, you double it, 1/4 of a second. Are we at 5 yet? Anyway, it will be 1/2 of a second. You get the drift. You can extend the length of your shutter speed before you introduce camera shake into your image. And why is this important? It's because maybe you're shooting in low light. It's maybe you want to shoot with your ISO a little bit lower. Maybe you want the best clarity and the best fidelity in your image. So therefore, keeping the ISO lower makes that happen. And it allows you to have flexibility around your shutter speeds. And that's what it means. And then you add the lens optical stabilization and say it's 3 stops of stabilization. If we use the example of the 400mm lens, you got the rule of thumb which suggests you should be 1/400th of a second, double it, 1/200th of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/50th of a second, 1/25th of a second, 1/13th of a second, 1/8th of a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/2 of a second. And that's a really long shutter speed. Now, I think I've got that correct. If you know any reasons why I haven't, let me know down below. But that's it, really simple. What does stops of image stabilization mean when it comes to the in-body image stabilization and also the optical stabilization in your lens? We nailed it. We nailed it. You've nailed it. Now you understand. Thanks heaps for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye.